On a gray morning in late February 2011, Travis Jennings turned a 1999 Ford F-250 into the co-op lot off the gravel line between Grundy County and Marshall County. The truck coughing once before idling hard, rust spread along both rocker panels, cracked vinyl on the bench seat, 312,000 miles showing in faded green on the instrument cluster. At 54, 6 weeks widowed, she stepped down in patched bib overalls and a canvas coat shiny at the elbows, then walked past 3 newer diesel pickups, where younger operators leaned against polished fenders and watched her like they were watching a weather report go bad. In that lot, appearance carried a price tag. New chrome meant progress. Worn denim meant decline. Someone said, quietly, but not quietly enough, that another small dairy would likely be sold by harvest. They were looking at a farm that milked 186 Holsteins and looked steady from the road, white fences upright, freestall roof sound, feed lane scraped clean. They were not looking at the note stack behind it. $742,600 left on the livestock note, $418,900 on land, and equipment leases draining $11,480 every month, whether milk checks came in strong or thin. They did not know she tracked mineral mix at 43 cents per cow per day, iodine dip at 7 cents per head, and exactly how much cash left each week through the bulk tank pump and never came back. Across Black Hawk County and outward in every direction, lenders had spent a decade treating leverage like common sense. Expansion was called discipline. Debt was called oxygen. Families compared horsepower the way earlier generations compared rainfall. Travis said almost nothing in public, paid for a pallet of calf starter, and left with the same slow truck sound that made people assume they had seen the beginning of an ending. By the first week of March, the pressure came in a 3-envelope sequence that would have pushed most operators to refinance and hope. The funeral home bill was $13,240, due in 30 days. The bank reset the variable herd note from 4.85% to 7.35%. Milk dropped from $18.70 per hundredweight to $15.10 before spring flush even started. 1 number was grief. 2 numbers were math. 3 numbers were a trap. Travis had not built her discipline in a seminar, and she did not build it out of fear alone. She built it across 32 years with her late husband, Glenn Jennings, one small correction at a time. In 1979, newly married and renting 80 acres, they bought 12 heifers for $7,800 total and a used International Harvester 1086 for $9,400 with 6,800 hours. They borrowed for both and spent the next 4 years learning what interest did when weather did not cooperate. In 1982, at 14.2% operating rates, they paid $11,760 in interest on a year that barely cleared $18,000 after feed. In 1983, with silage yield down and hay bought at premium, they paid $13,440 in interest and postponed replacing a failing vacuum pump until it nearly cost them the bulk tank. They survived, but survival felt like working for paper. The formative mark came in 1985 when Travis stood on a county line auction lot and watched Glenn's uncle lose 160 acres he had farmed for 29 years. Nobody was reckless in that story. He had borrowed to expand at what looked like manageable terms, then watched rates jump and grain prices flatten at the same time. His final ledger line showed assets on paper and no liquidity in reality. Travis never forgot the look on his face when machinery he had maintained for decades sold in 12 minutes to strangers holding bitter cards and coffee cups. After that day, she and Glenn adopted one household rule and one farm rule. Household rule: if it did not keep people healthy, warm, or employed, it waited. Farm rule: if a purchase could not survive a bad price year without refinancing, it did not happen. Their methods looked plain, sometimes severe. They bought used implements in winter, repaired instead of replacing, and paid principal first whenever milk checks beat budget. They did not stop borrowing overnight. They shortened it. In 1988, they refinanced a remaining machinery balance from 7 years to 3, raised monthly payment from $612 to $1,118, and saved $6,204 in total interest. In 1994, they bought 120 acres at $1,270 per acre, 25% down, fixed at 7.1%, then sent one extra principal payment every quarter for 9 years. That single habit removed 6.4 years from the amortization schedule and saved $58,000 in interest. By 2003, they were not debt-free, but they were debt-intentional, and that distinction mattered when markets stopped being kind. Glenn handled forage planning. Travis handled ledgers and culling thresholds. She could tell you, from memory, whether a cow with repeat mastitis and lower component tests should stay one more cycle or leave at next truck day. He wrote feed notes in pencil in an old grain bin logbook. She wrote debt ratios in blue ink on legal pads. They were not flashy operators, but they were exact. The paradox was visible even then. They looked one veterinary bill away from trouble while quietly reducing long-term exposure every year. Then Glenn died of a sudden heart event in January 2011, and all prior discipline got stress-tested in one season. At the kitchen table, under a yellowed light fixture they had installed in 1997, Travis laid out payment books, milk check stubs, and current contracts and ran the next 12 months line by line. If nothing changed, annual debt service would reach $137,760 against projected net farm income of $102,400. That was a guaranteed cash deficit of $35,360 before surprise repairs, before weather, before any family emergency. Liquidation timeline, roughly 18 months. Hank Bolger arrived 2 days later in a pressed dealership shirt, clean logo cap, and a new 1-ton pickup that had never seen manure dust on the floor mat. He was not a cartoon villain. He was the prevailing model in human form, and he had moved a lot of iron to good people during easy credit years. He told Travis the only professional move was to roll everything into a 10-year package, add a modern parlor, improve throughput, gain efficiency, and restore confidence with lenders. Additional financed amount, $389,000 at 8.1%. He spoke in polished urgency about scale, competitiveness, and timing. Travis listened without interrupting, asked one question, and wrote down his answer in block letters. Monthly payment, $7,412. She circled it twice, thanked him, and walked him to the door. By the second week of March, she began a 3-year austerity program that looked to neighbors like surrender and felt to her like oxygen. First move, cull and sell 32 lower-yield cows for $46,080, average $1,440 each, reducing purchased feed, demand immediately. Second move, park the leased mixer wagon and return it at penalty. Then pull a 1978 feed grinder from the back shed and rebuild it with $1,140 in bearings, belts, and a salvaged drive coupling instead of financing a $52,000 replacement. Third move, Freeze household spending at $19,600 for the year. Food $6,480. Utilities $4,920. Insurance $3,100. Fuel $2,700. Clothing $420. Church and community giving $1,200. Everything else delayed unless it affected herd health or principal reduction. No vacation line, no restaurant line, no vanity line. She also changed income structure in small, unglamorous increments. A neighboring operator needed custom heifer boarding and could not justify new bunk space. So Travis took 24 head at $2.35 per head per day net after bedding, adding roughly $20,586 annual gross and about $13,900 after direct costs. She prepaid mineral and seed when suppliers offered off-season discounts of 4 to 7%, paid cash, and cut total input spend by $11,300 the first full cycle. She called her lender monthly, not to request extensions, but to confirm principal posted correctly. Travis knew where this kind of discipline led when a county assumed she was finished. The arithmetic. Because the next years did not reward optimism, they rewarded cash control. By year-end 2011, she had paid $94,000 against combined obligations. In 2012, with tighter culling and better feed conversion, she paid $128,500. In 2013, with custom heifer income stabilized, she paid $161,200. The farm still looked modest, even worn. The truck still rattled. The overalls were still patched. But liabilities were shrinking faster than anyone in the co-op lot guessed. Around her, good farmers took the conventional lane and got caught by timing, not laziness. Neil Porter expanded on variable credit and lost 240 acres when his line reset to 9.4%. Dana and Cole Reamer financed a $1.2 million robotic expansion and later watched equipment tags go up at auction. Luis Mendoza saw drought push feed costs high enough that rolling operating debt became unworkable. Beth Kalinsky sold her herd to meet balloon payments after milk checks weakened. Travis did not mock any of them. She brought meals during one sale week and sent hay contacts when she had them. She simply kept paying principal, one ugly month and one exact number at a time. The week after Beth Kalinsky's dispersal sale, Travis pulled into the Conrad Livestock Exchange before daylight with the same 1999 Ford and the same cracked bench seat, now carrying a coffee thermos, a legal pad, and a cashier check for $28,400 folded into an envelope with feed invoices. She wore patched gloves with the fingertips restitched in black thread, and one overall strap had been repaired with a strip cut from an old halter. Two brothers from Tama County stood by a polished crew cab pickup and glanced at her truck before one of them asked the clerk, loud enough to travel, whether the Jennings place was liquidating next. The clerk checked the sales sheet and said, "No, buyer number 117, pre-registered." At the rail, Hank Bolger appeared again in a pressed dealership jacket, clean boots and a smile that carried both confidence and pity. He told another bidder, "Some operators are trying to save pennies while the industry is moving to systems." Travis did not answer. She marked 3 lot numbers, circled a maximum bid beside each, and wrote one phrase under them: "No financing under any weather." At lot 42, she bought a used tandem forage wagon for $6,900 that a dealer had listed privately the month prior for $14,500. At lot 63, she passed on a loader tractor when bidding crossed her cap by $400, even though she needed one before corn silage season. At lot 79, she secured 40 used freestall loops at $55 each, total $2,200, then paid $640 for transport, and installed them herself with Neil Porter after evening milking, paying him in cash and diesel. Nothing looked dramatic in isolation. That was the underlying method. Incremental wins, no borrowed urgency, no pride purchases. Back in the truck after the sale, she opened the legal pad across the steering wheel and wrote the same 2 columns she had carried through every hard month since Glenn's funeral. Obligation, due this month. Obligation that can't be deferred next month. If an item lived in both columns too long, it became a threat, no matter how reasonable it sounded in a sales office. That filter had shaped each decision from the second week of March 2011 onward, when the funeral bill came due. The herd note reset to 7.35%. Milk dropped to $15.10 per hundredweight, and her own projection showed annual debt service at $137,760 against net farm income of $102,400. She had read that gap as an 18-month liquidation clock if nothing changed. The record of what changed sat in binders behind the truck seat, tabbed by month. March 2011, sell 32 cows, return the mixer wagon, rebuild the 1978 grinder, lock household spending at $19,600. April through December, every extra dollar to principal, no exceptions. She kept unit cost lines so fine-grained that mineral mix and iodine dip had their own trend marks, and she checked them against milk checks with a ruler and red pen. The neighbors who laughed at patch coveralls did not see those pages. They did not see how quickly small line items became large margin leakage when lenders set the calendar. They saw old paint and assumed decline. She saw timing risk and treated it like disease control. Hank's pitch had never changed much. In 2011, it came as a 10-year refinance, plus a new parlor, $389,000 added at 8.1%, $7,412 monthly. In 2012, it came as modernization language and glossy paper. In 2013, it came as warnings that old equipment was a single breakdown away from catastrophe. Each time, Travis ran the same test. What decision rights disappear first when prices move wrong? She did not reject machines because they were new. She rejected fixed obligations that would still collect in a bad milk year before feed, before seed, before repairs, before sleep. The years had already given her enough evidence in other farm driveways to know what came next when those obligations stacked. When Glenn died, that framework hardened from shared habit into policy. The bank officer handling her file, Martin Hale, expected negotiation in spring 2011 and instead received monthly envelopes with principal reductions and penciled notes requesting corrected posting dates when processing lagged. Martin later told his assistant that Travis was the only borrower on his desk who sent a reconciliation sheet more precise than the bank printout. In April 2012, he offered to restructure remaining equipment obligations at 6.9% to smooth pressure. Travis thanked him and declined in 7 words. Pressure now is cheaper than pressure later. By late June 2012, the first hay cutting came in thinner than average, and she had to choose between buying extra feed at $212 per ton or liquidating another group of low performers. She sold 14 more cows, averaging 58 pounds daily, versus herd average 71, receiving $18,620 total, then redirected that cash toward debt and forage seed. Outsiders read each sale as retreat. Her ledger read it as margin protection. Fewer cows with stronger conversion, generated cleaner cash than a larger herd fed on expensive, purchased roughage. Her rolling figure for purchased feed as a share of milk revenue moved from 49% to 41% over 14 months. That single shift freed about $62,000 across 2 years, most of which went straight to principal. 3 days after the 4th of July in 2012, Hank stopped by again with a glossy packet for a turnkey parlor upgrade and nutrient system. Package price $389,000, 8.1%, 10-year note. He said modern producers were scaling through technology and warned that running old iron can turn one breakdown into disaster. Travis pointed to the 1978 grinder, now rebuilt, and asked him what one financed month on his package cost. He answered $7,412, same as before. She said, "That is my annual repair budget doubled." He stood in the lane for a long minute, then left the packet on the truck hood. Rain ruined it by evening. She never moved it inside. The payments kept moving in one direction. In 2011, she cleared $94,000. In 2012, she cleared $128,500. In 2013, she cleared $161,200, helped by custom heifer boarding that added cash without locking her into new note payments. She treated that added income like a pressure valve, not a lifestyle upgrade. It went where all unexpected cash went. Principal first, then critical maintenance, then nothing else. At the co-op counter, she still bought in work gloves by price per pair and skipped anything with a logo premium. At home, she kept the same cap on household spending she had set in the first shock months, because volatility had not signed any contract promising to stay away. Through 2013, she treated frugality as system design rather than temporary hardship. Household cash outflow stayed at $19,600, but composition tightened further. Food, $6,310 through bulk cooking and freezer planning, utilities $4,780 after insulation, and a used water heater installed for $410. Insurance $3,140. Fuel $2,860. Clothing $390, giving $1,200. Medical out-of-pocket $920. She tracked cost per hundredweight weekly and drew a red line across any month above target. When a vacuum pump motor failed in August, quoted replacement was $4,900 plus labor. She sourced a rebuilt motor for $1,350, paid $280 to a retired electrician, and was running by next morning. Cash preserved, roughly $3,270. That amount became an extra principal payment in September. She kept seeing the same regional pattern from the same vantage point. Not laziness, not ignorance, but timing. Neil Porter was still carrying the loss of 240 acres after a variable rate reset he had assumed would normalize before harvest. Dana and Cole Reamer had financed robotic expansion and watched the system go to auction when revenue did not catch the payment curve fast enough. Luis Mendoza got trapped when feed cost shock collided with operating debt he could no longer roll. Beth Kalinsky sold the herd to satisfy balloon dates that arrived exactly when margins thinned. Travis did not use their names as cautionary speeches. She used them as reminders that one bad season can be absorbed, but one rigid payment schedule during a bad season can end a farm. By the second week of January 2014, her debt sequence looked different enough that even skeptics had to recalculate. Combined principal paid since Glenn's death had reached $383,700. Equipment leases were down to a final stack she could clear that year. Martin Hale called with updated balances and, for the first time, asked her what ratio she was targeting. Travis answered, "No forced sale risk." He laughed softly, nodded at her, and said he wished half his portfolio used that metric. At the same co-op lot where people once predicted her exit, Neil Porter now climbed into her passenger seat, looked at the frayed steering wheel tape, and asked if she would review his own expense sheet before renewal season. He had already lost 240 acres, and the loss sat on him like weather that would not pass. Travis did not offer a lecture. She brought a pencil, drew 2 columns, and helped him separate costs that kept crops alive from costs that kept up appearances. That night, she wrote a check for $6,000 to cover his spring seed discount deadline. 0 interest, due after harvest if possible. He paid back $4,000 in November and the final $2,000 by the following June. The paradox was now visible to anyone willing to look without pride. The worn truck, the patched overalls, the repaired machinery, and a balance sheet moving steadily toward autonomy. She had been judged at the rail, in the lot, and at the mailbox. She answered each judgment with settled numbers. And then she went back to work, because numbers only matter if they survive chore time. That afternoon, she marked February feed shrink at 3.8%, called the nutrition supplier to lock mineral at $508 per ton before the spring increase, and moved $12,000 from the operating account to principal without waiting for quarter end. By late March 2014, Martin Hale sent revised amortization sheets showing what her pace had already changed. The equipment lease stack that once drained $11,480 monthly could be closed by December if she held payments above schedule through summer. The year unfolded exactly that way, one controlled month after another. Milk averaged 67.4 pounds per cow per day across 182 milkers, lower head count than neighbors but stronger components at 3.91 butterfat and 3.14 protein. Gross milk revenue for 2014 came to $1,019,860 with an average mailbox price of $16.42 per hundredweight. Custom heifer boarding added $21,104 gross. Total farm revenue reached $1,093,770. She held direct feed cost to $397,600, labor to $146,300, including part-time help, repairs to $34,920, utilities and fuel to $78,440, insurance and compliance to $32,180, leaving operating margin before debt service at $404,330. From that margin, she paid $176,840 to principal and $46,210 to interest, then closed the final lease with a December payment of $24,600. Lease burden gone. By the first week of January 2015, the ledger looked cleaner than anyone expected in that co-op parking lot 4 years earlier. Livestock note balance sat at $221,130. Land mortgage sat at $291,200. No equipment leases remained. Martin offered a routine temptation, wrapped as convenience, a 7-year machinery line pre-approved at 6.4%, available if needed. Travis thanked him, declined, and asked instead whether she could recast the land note at 3.9% fixed without extending maturity. She paid the legal fee in cash, kept the existing payoff horizon, and cut projected future interest by $34,870. Her year-by-year sequence after that reads like documentary shorthand, but every line required restraint that did not photograph well. 2015. No new notes. Paid $133,700 on livestock, including final wire of $87,430 in October, paid $46,800 on land, ended year with zero herd debt. 2016. Forage stress year, paid $31,500 on land despite feed volatility, set aside $90,000 in 3- and 6-month Treasury ladder tranches. 2017. Paid $21,400 land principal, added $140,000 retained earnings to short-term instruments averaging 1.8 to 2.1%. 2018. Paid $18,500 land principal. Land balance reached $173,000. Operating debt remained zero. The visual presentation of the farm never changed much. The financial architecture changed completely. There was no lifestyle release valve hiding inside those gains. Household spending in 2015 was $20,040 after a health deductible jump. In 2016, it was $20,380. In 2017, it dropped to $19,910. In 2018, it was $21,240 after replacing a failing well pressure system. Clothing stayed below $500 each year. The truck stayed in service. She still patched gloves. She still bought parts instead of packages. One side-by-side comparison from her notes became local legend after Martin repeated it at a lender roundtable without naming her. $1,140 to rebuild the old grinder versus $52,000 finance for replacement. Over 7 years at 6.9%, that avoided payment stream preserved roughly $63,700 in cash outflow. By August 2015, when corn silage moisture ran high and many operators were scrambling for custom chopping slots, Travis used a used self-propelled harvester purchased at a state sale for $18,900 cash, plus $3,260 in preseason repairs. A comparable finance package from a dealer lot would have cost $214,000 with annual payments near $31,000. Her total annual ownership and repair cost over the next 3 years averaged $8,470. The machine was not pretty. It was punctual. That distinction kept cash under her control. The question hovering over those seasons stayed mostly unspoken in public rooms. Whether to hold a disciplined line while appearances suggested scarcity, or borrow to quiet the social pressure of visible upgrades. Over the next 2 years, that tension would be answered with painful clarity across 3 counties. The contrast was not between smart people and careless people. It was between balance sheets exposed to rate risk and one balance sheet built to absorb bad timing. Neil Porter had expanded when variable terms were favorable, then lost 240 acres when rates reset and yields missed. By 2015, he was renting 110 acres back at $268 per acre, while servicing restructured debt at 8.2%. His annual interest alone was $41,600, more than his hired labor budget. He sold a nearly new planter for $62,000 less than purchase price to stay current. He was up before dawn every day, and still the numbers cornered him. Dana and Cole Reamer carried the heaviest burden. Their $1.2 million robotic expansion had been built on optimistic throughput assumptions and a blended cost of capital above 6% once variable pieces adjusted. Monthly debt obligations reached $11,900. When milk checks softened and maintenance calls rose, they began floating feed on terms they never intended to use. By spring 2016, they had $184,000 in payables over 30 days and no refinancing path left. The auction cleared assets, but proceeds did not clear liabilities. They owed a deficiency for years afterward. Travis never described them as a warning. She described them as hard-working neighbors who trusted a model that failed under stress. Louis Mendoza's squeeze came from feed and operating credit at the same time. His line balance in early 2016 was $386,000 priced variable. Drought pressure in his supplier network doubled. Purchased roughage quotes from around $162 per ton to over $320 in some weeks, and his rate moved from 5.2% to 8.9% by year-end. Carrying cost and feed cost rose together, the exact combination that breaks even disciplined farms when debt is short and prices are unstable. He culled hard, sold machinery he liked, and still had to disperse part of the herd. Beth Kalinsky, already out of milking, tried to preserve her remaining land position by leasing barns and taking custom young stock, but a balloon structure, tied to her earlier facility loan, left little room. She met every lender call, signed every extension offered, and sold carefully, not desperately, yet still lost control of timing. She later told Travis that the emotional weight was not the sale day itself, but the months of making payments with no path to principal reduction. Travis understood that sentence better than most. By the second week of July 2016, crisis reached everyone at once through forage. Hay in her area touched $248 per ton. Corn silage yields were uneven. Operators with high debt loads borrowed emergency feed money at rates that would haunt the next 2 years. Travis opened an old grain bin ledger that had belonged to Glenn, pages curled at the corners, pencil notes faded but legible. One line appeared across multiple seasons in his handwriting. Own feed, own timing, own future. She read it twice, closed the book, and called a retired landlord who had 140 neglected acres available under a 3-year cash lease. Terms were plain: $210 per acre annual rent, paid on March 1st each year, tenant responsible for fertility correction and drainage. First-year outflow for lime, tile repair, and reseeding totaled $38,900, paid from savings. No operating line draw, no machinery borrowing. She hired Neil Porter to run tile trenching with his older rig at $92 per hour, giving him winter income while keeping the work local. In the first full season, those acres produced 612 tons of mixed haylage equivalent at an all-in cost near $168 per ton, including lease allocation, well below emergency market pricing. 3 days after that lease was signed, Hank Bolger drove in again, now pitching a financed feed system with telemetry and automated batching. He framed it as protection against volatility. Package price was $264,000, quoted at 7.6% over 8 years. Monthly payment $3,773. Travis asked for service call rates and software subscription terms, wrote both down, then said the same sentence she had used for years in different forms. I do not borrow to solve borrowed vulnerability. Hank stood by the lane fence, looked over the patched gate latch and old grinder, and replied that she was limiting growth. She said nothing else. The numbers would answer him later. By November 2016, the forage decision had already shifted risk. Purchased feed dependence dropped from 62% of ration inputs to 44% in one cycle. By the end of 2018, it reached 27%. That change did more than cut costs. It removed lender permission from the most fragile line item in a dairy budget. During the same period, she built a liquidity buffer in Treasury maturities and insured cash, laddered to 12 months, so that any input spike could be met without panic borrowing. At year-end 2018, she held $1,286,000 in liquid reserves and short-term securities against no operating debt. The regional policy backdrop added pressure where leverage remained high. Property tax assessments rose. Crop insurance terms tightened for some operations after loss years. Input suppliers shortened payment windows from 60 days to 30 for accounts with weak credit profiles. Farms carrying large monthly obligations had to accept higher seasonal prices because they could not prepay. Travis prepaid. In spring 2018, she bought fertilizer at off-season discount, saving $41 per ton on 280 tons, total savings $11,480, then redirected every dollar of that discount into land principal and reserve growth. By late October 2018, Martin Hale visited the farm office with updated statements and sat across from her at the same table where she had once projected an 18-month liquidation clock. He reviewed balances line by line. Livestock note, 0. Equipment leases, 0. Operating line, 0. Land mortgage, $173,000 fixed at 3.9%. Audited retained earnings and reserves now large enough to self-finance, a major purchase if timing and price aligned. He closed the folder and said quietly, "Most people confuse revenue with control." Travis nodded, slid the folder into a metal drawer, and went back to evening chores while the yard light came on, over a truck everyone still underestimated. The next morning, she was in the parlor before dawn, and the folder Martin had carried in and out of her office stayed shut in the drawer while she checked vacuum pressure and somatic counts like any other day. That was the pattern people kept missing. She never treated a cleaner balance sheet as a finish line. She treated it as operating room. Through the winter, she kept building liquidity in short maturities, not to make a statement, but because optionality is purchased long before opportunity arrives. By the second week of November 2019, opportunity arrived in the form most families in that corridor feared most: a bankruptcy auction with adjoining ground on the bill. The auction sat on cold stubble south of the county line, ring truck idling, clerks hunched over clipboards, lenders and landlords standing in knots that mixed sympathy and calculation. The tract was 310 acres that touched Jennings pasture on the east fence, 278 tillable by survey, the rest waterway, lane, and a rough timber corner that held snow longer than the open fields. Bidding opened at $6,100 per acre and moved in quick lifts. Two finance bidders from outside the township pushed it to $6,900. Hank Bolger stood beside them in a clean, insulated coat and said, not softly, that cash buyers did not come in trucks with rusted fenders and taped steering wheels. Travis, in a faded coat with a mended cuff, raised one finger at $7,050, then again at $7,150, then at $7,250. The ringman called fair warning twice. No one topped it. Sold. Total contract price was $2,247,500. Auction terms required immediate verified funds and 30-day close on remainder. Travis handed over a cashier check for $1,180,000 drawn that morning from insured cash balances. The remaining $1,067,500 was documented through Treasury ladder maturities and retained earnings scheduled inside the closing window. Hank asked to see issuing verification, then phoned the bank number printed on the draft while standing 3 feet from the clerk table. The confirmation was immediate. Funds good. Hold status none. He ended the call and said nothing for a long stretch that everyone around him felt. By the first week of December, she was at the title office before opening with a thermos and a legal pad, while the closer walked through meets and bounds, exceptions, and tax proration line by line. Deed recorded, title policy issued, drainage maps updated. She approved a conservative first-year crop plan built around soil recovery rather than maximum extraction, then released $142,600 for tile rehabilitation, lime, and 2 culvert rebuilds on the new tract, all cash. That afternoon, she was back in chore boots before dark check. No celebratory truck, no house remodel, no new wardrobe. She still brought lunch in a reused pail and still wore patch gloves. The visible routine did not change. The operating posture did. She now controlled enough land and liquidity to set terms when others had to accept them. In January 2020, she met with a local attorney, an accountant in a conference room above a hardware storefront, and funded the Jennings Working Farm Fund with $1,500,000. Structured as a restricted agricultural assistance trust with annual disbursement limits tied to repayment performance. She reviewed each covenant herself, blue ink in the margins where language drifted toward vagueness. The final text in every agreement stayed plain. Stay current, stay modest, and when your note is gone, finance one more beginner without charging interest. The first notes went out over the next 22 months. Mariah Sutter signed for $42,000 on a used manure spreader and skid loader package after 2 vendor inspections verified serviceable drivetrains. Owen Pike took $55,000 for hay equipment sized to his acreage instead of the larger package he had first considered. Eli and Nora Vance, a sibling partnership, took $68,000 for a rebuilt bulk tank and plate cooler with installation benchmarks tied to milk quality testing. Neil Porter signed for $73,000 for a no-till drill and sprayer retrofit that would let him keep paid tile trenching while adding custom fieldwork windows. Beth Kalinsky, already known for disciplined calf routines after her own constrained years, took $81,000 for calf barn ventilation and pasteurizer upgrades tied to apprentice training. Rowan Dyer took $95,000 for a used forage harvester with verified service records and parts availability inside 2 counties. Every note was 0 interest, 5 to 7 years, with payment pauses allowed only for documented weather or health shocks. By the end of each borrower's first full cycle, the numbers began to separate signal from talk. Mariah Sutter cut custom hauling costs by $18,400 and turned cash flow positive by month 11. Owen Pike reduced dry matter losses enough to improve winter margins by roughly $21,000. Eli and Nora Vance lifted milk quality premiums by $0.46 per hundredweight after cooling improvements, producing an extra $34,700 in year 1 and paying down principal ahead of schedule. Neil Porter, who once lost 240 acres under variable rate pressure, used his equipment loan to secure custom work and then took on crop rotation management across Jennings acres under a profit share agreement that paid him $96,300 in 2023. Beth Kalinsky used the Calf Health loan to build the apprenticeship track the fund required. Her trainees posted pre-wean mortality under 2.1% across 3 cohorts, and she moved into stable management income with no new debt. Rowan Dyer met every payment date through 2024 and financed 2 beginning operators exactly as required once his own note cleared. The Reamer line took longer to stabilize, and the structure reflected that. Dana and Cole Reamer had carried the weight of their auction and deficiency for years, and their son, Grant Reamer, wanted back into dairying without repeating the leverage pattern that had hurt his parents. Travis funded a reentry package of $180,000, not as an unstructured grant, but as staged capital tied to used assets and audited cost caps. Grant bought 74 springing heifers at an average of $1,860, secured a used parlor line for $38,500, and installed refurbished stalls and piping for $22,700 with local labor. He opened with no operating note and a 6-month reserve requirement inside the agreement. By his second full year, he had positive retained earnings and had hired 1 full-time employee at a living wage. Dana handled records 3 days a week. Cole managed cropping on a neighboring lease. Their household was stable again, not flashy, but stable. In March 2022, she made the land decision that still circulates at coffee counters. Luis Mendoza's daughter, Elena Mendoza, had AG training, strong records, and no realistic path to ownership at prevailing county prices. Market on a specific 60-acre tract near water and road access was about $8,100 per acre. Travis sold it to Elena for $4,200 per acre, total $252,000 instead of $486,000. With seller financing at 0 interest over 12 years and a conservation covenant that protected soil practices and prohibited speculative resale in the first decade. The implicit equity transfer was $234,000 on day 1. Elena used that margin to invest in fencing, water lines, and forage establishment without borrowing short-term money at peak rates. Luis, squeezed for years by feed costs and variable rate cycles, now worked that ground with his daughter and said the first year they slept through billing cycles was the first year they believed the farm would remain in the family. The arithmetic beneath those decisions stayed as plain as her old 2-column pages and as non-trivial as timing always is. If she had accepted Hank's 2011 package, the added $389,000 at 8.1% over 10 years, would have cost roughly $57,700 annually before related service contracts and downtime risk. Add the 2016 financed feed system pitch at $264,000 and 7.6% over 8 years, and that is another $45,300 annualized when service and subscription are included. Combined, those 2 choices would have introduced about $103,000 in fixed yearly obligations on top of existing commitments during volatile milk and feed cycles. Instead, she used repairs, culling discipline, feed independence, and prepaid discounts to keep fixed costs low and variable choices open. From 2011 through 2018, measured principal reduction and avoided interest produced an estimated cumulative cash advantage above $1,940,000 versus a matched peer profile that expanded on debt in the same price environment. After the 2019 land close, the ledger remained equally direct. By year-end 2019, after acquisition and improvements, liquidity had rebuilt to $612,000. In 2020, she milked 204 cows, posted net operating margin of $486,400, deployed $420,000 in fund capital, and carried no operating debt. In 2021, owned acreage sat at 980 after a small parcel adjustment. Retained earnings added $533,700, and fund repayments of $118,000 were received and reissued. In 2022, acreage reached 1,040 with final tract alignment, and audited net worth crossed $7,900,000. In 2023, the milking herd reached 220, purchased feed share held below 30%, and net worth reached $8,640,000 after conservative valuation haircuts. By spring 2024, the truck odometer read 347,000. The patch coat was still in service, and audited operating debt was still zero. That is where her framework stopped looking like private preference and started functioning as local infrastructure. Through the fund and discounted land actions, direct capital deployed reached $2,357,000, counting the Mendoza equity transfer. By 2024, recipients and linked operations controlled 3,460 acres, either owned or under stable long-term arrangements. At blended local values near $7,900 per acre, that land position represented roughly $27,334,000 in productive base, protected from high-interest churn. Loan repayment performance sat at 98.2% on-time equivalent, and every completed borrower either mentored or financed at least one newer entrant exactly as contracted. The multiplier was not charity theater. It was disciplined recursion. Hank Bolger watched enough of those numbers up close that his own trajectory shifted. He retired in 2025, but in his final 2 years, he began recommending quality-used equipment first for clients with tight margins and rate exposure. He told younger sales staff that commission is easy in a boom and brutal in a correction, and that one farmer in patched overalls had forced him to relearn what durability looks like. Martin Hale remained at the bank using forced sale risk as a standing line in annual reviews. Neil Porter still ran rotation blocks on Jennings ground. Beth Kalinsky still led calf health apprentices through the fund. Dana and Cole Reamer were back in dairying through Grant's operation. Luis and Elena Mendoza were current on every payment. Travis still drove the same truck down the same gravel, and when people asked about the rules she wrote into every note, she answered in 12 words and went back to chores. Stay current, stay modest, then help the next one start. She answered in 12 words and went back to chores, and the next measurable proof arrived before that week ended, when Mariah Sutter brought her 4th annual statement to the farm office with every line highlighted in yellow. The zero-interest note for $42,000 had started as manure handling and loader reliability. By then, it had become working capital discipline. Mariah had retired the balance in 46 months, 14 months ahead of schedule, after cutting outside hauling, repairing rather than rotating trucks, and holding family spending under $28,000 even when milk checks improved. Under the fund covenant, she then issued a $24,000 zero-interest starter note to a beginning beef operator on 80 leased acres and filed the contract with Beth Kalinsky for compliance review. The recursion had started to self-propel. Owen Pike followed with a slower but equally stable trajectory. His $55,000 equipment note had originally looked modest against his acreage, yet it was exactly scaled to his forage volumes and labor reality. In his second and third years, he dropped dry matter loss from 14.8% to 8.9%, banked the spread, and avoided the spring operating lines that had trapped neighbors in prior cycles. He stayed current through a wet harvest by delaying a pickup replacement and welding his own rake frame. When his note closed, he financed half the cost of a used tedder for a younger hay producer at zero interest and required monthly cost tracking as a condition. The lesson traveled with the money. Eli and Nora Vance turned their $68,000 cooling and bulk tank upgrade into quality premiums that held through 2 volatile milk years. They did not celebrate with expansion debt. They split surplus 3 ways: principal, reserve, and deferred maintenance. By the first quarter after payoff, they held $96,400 in liquid reserves and no operating note, then offered 3 apprentices weekend shifts through Beth's calf health program, paying each above local entry wage and teaching ledger discipline at the kitchen table after chores. Their small dairy did not look modern from the road. Their net position was stronger than operations twice their size. Let me stop here and ask you something. If you had one good year after a decade of pressure, would you spend it to look successful? Or would you store it to stay independent? That choice sat under every outcome in this county, and the arithmetic kept exposing it. Neil Porter's line may have been the most emotionally complex. He had carried loss in public, then rebuilt in private. First through the $73,000 no-till and sprayer retrofit, then through rotation management on Jennings ground. By the end of 2025, his profit share and custom work income reached $118,700 annualized. His restructured debt balance had fallen below $140,000, and he had rebuilt enough credibility to secure a fixed-rate refinance at 5.1% instead of variable exposure. He was not back in the way coffee shop stories define comeback. He was solvent, current, and sleeping. That was the better metric. Beth Kalinsky's $81,000 calf system note matured into institutional value for the whole fund. She built written protocols, trained apprentices in colostrum timing and ventilation checks, and introduced penalty clauses in trainee agreements for skipped records because she had learned firsthand what weak documentation costs when lenders control the clock. Her repayment stayed perfect. More importantly, pre-wean losses across fund-linked herds averaged 2.3% by 2026, down from a baseline near 5.9%. That single biological improvement added measurable revenue across multiple farms without adding debt to any of them. Rowan Dyer, with the $95,000 forage harvester package, had the highest mechanical risk and the cleanest compliance file. He cleared his note on schedule, then financed 2 beginners as required, both with capped acreage and mandatory cash reserve targets. One remained in custom forage and one shifted to mixed livestock, both current at year-end review. Grant Reamer kept his 6-month reserve covenant intact, crossed break-even ahead of projection, and by his 3rd full cycle had retained earnings sufficient to replace a critical pump in cash within 24 hours of failure. Dana and Cole Reamer remained active inside the operation without signing new personal debt guarantees. Their recovery was quiet, technical, and real. By the 2nd week of September 2026, fund audits showed the multiplier in hard terms. Original direct deployments and equity transfers tied to Travis's decisions totaled $2,357,000. Linked repayments and required relending had generated an additional $1,184,000 in zero-interest circulation. Combined influence reached $3,541,000 in productive capital movement without commercial rate drag. On-time equivalent repayment held at 97.9% after weather adjustments. Not one forced liquidation had occurred among funded recipients. No speeches created that result. Contract design did. If you are learning something from this, tap like and share it. Because most people never see the math behind who survives volatility and who gets sold out by timing. Hank Bolger's resolution unfolded without spectacle, which fit the story better than any dramatic apology could. In his final years before retirement in 2025, he had already shifted to recommending used units and lower fixed-cost pathways for operators with thin margins. But the deeper change became clear when he accepted a winter panel invitation at the County Extension Hall and used his own old sales sheets as teaching exhibits. He showed how a $389,000 package at 8.1% layered onto strained cash flow in 2011 conditions, then compared it with Travis's repair-first model and principal acceleration. He did not excuse himself. He said he had confused throughput with resilience. After retirement, he did part-time consulting for 2 dealerships on inventory strategy. His recommendation was simple: stock fewer prestige units, more serviceable used equipment with verified part support, and train sales staff to run downside scenarios before quoting payment plans. Commission volume dropped in boom months, and default-linked reputational damage dropped in correction months. He told younger reps that he had spent years selling confidence on credit and had to relearn the difference between a customer and a survivor. Around Black Hawk County, he was treated with more respect, not less, because he changed in public and attached his name to the correction. He and Travis were never friends in any sentimental sense, but by 2026 they could stand at the same auction rail, discuss bearing wear and payment risk in plain language, and leave the conversation without residue. By late autumn 2026, the roll call had become a living ledger that reached across both counties. Martin Hale remained at the bank and built forced sale risk into every dairy review template. Borrowers who arrived with expansion plans now had to model a bad price year before approval. Neil Porter managed rotation blocks and still ran winter tile jobs. Beth Kalinsky directed calf health apprentices and certified 2 new trainers. Mariah Sutter maintained 0 operating debt and expanded only when cash covered 70% up front. Owen Pike held his reserve discipline and trained his nephew on unit cost logging. Eli and Nora Vance stayed modest, profitable, and debt-light. Rowan Dyer continued custom forage and mentorship compliance. Grant Reamer's dairy employed 3 full-time workers by then, with Dana on records and Cole on cropping. Luis and Elena Mendoza stayed current on every seller finance payment and improved pasture carrying capacity, enough to add seasonal grazing contracts. Travis stayed where she had always been, in chore clothes, with patched gloves in the truck door and a legal pad on the office shelf. The 1999 Ford F-250 still ran with careful maintenance, though the odometer had moved past 360,000. The 1978 grinder still turned feed, rebuilt again with parts and patience. The old grain bin ledger Glenn had kept was no longer just memory material. Beth had it scanned, indexed, and added to the fund's training binder so every new borrower could read the penciled line that had survived drought, rates, and social pressure. Own feed, own timing, own future. The ruined glossy packet Hank once left on the hood had long since been discarded, noted in Travis's records as declined financing exhibit, weather damaged, not retained. Even that had closure. On the first Monday of January 2027, auditors confirmed farm operating debt at 0, fund-linked relending active, and net worth stable, despite conservative land valuation adjustments. Travis signed the annual documents, checked the afternoon calving list, and asked Beth to verify 2 apprentice logs before supper. Nothing in her routine suggested status. That was still the point. Appearance was static. Capacity had changed. Before we close, subscribe if you want more stories where arithmetic matters more than image. In the comments, tell me which rule is hardest to follow in real life: staying modest when cash improves, or refusing debt when everyone says leverage is growth. Share this with one person who is working hard, looks ordinary, and is being underestimated because their truck is old and their clothes are worn. The thesis did not require decoration anymore. In this corridor between Grundy and Marshall counties, the farmer who looked poorest in the co-op lot became the one with the most control when timing turned hostile. Debt had promised speed and often delivered fragility. Discipline had looked slow and delivered options. And when options accumulated long enough, they became generosity with structure, not charity with cameras. At dusk, the yard light came on above the same gravel drive, the same patched gate latch, and the same truck cooling beside the barn, while inside the office a plain language note sat ready for the next beginner. Stay current, stay modest, and when your note is gone, finance one more without charging interest. At dusk, the note did not stay on the desk for long. Travis heard boots on the porch boards, opened the office door, and found Neil Porter holding a manila envelope and a coffee can full of receipts sorted by month. He set both on the table, took off his cap, and said, "I closed mine this morning." Inside the envelope was a stamped lien release on the $73,000 fund note, final payment posted 2 weeks early. Inside the coffee can were copies of his first 2 relending contracts, both zero interest, both capped to equipment that could be repaired locally, both requiring reserve targets before any household upgrades. Travis read every page, circled 2 missing serial numbers, and slid the contracts back. "Add those and file by Friday." Neil nodded. "Already called Beth. She is checking logs tonight." That same week, Beth Kalinsky ran compliance night at the old extension room in Conrad. Fluorescent lights humming, folding chairs set in a circle. No speeches, no banners. Mariah Sutter arrived with a printed cash flow sheet that showed $312,400 gross farm revenue, $41,700 total equipment expense, and 0 operating debt at year end. Owen Pike brought moisture loss charts and a reserve account statement at $84,200. Eli and Nora Vance turned in quality premium reports, then handed Beth 3 signed apprentice evaluations with error rates below 1.5%. Rowan Dyer delivered service logs for the harvester financed under his old note and 2 new beginner contracts with repair escrow clauses. Grant Reamer came last, wearing chore boots and carrying his own ledger, not his parents'. He reported retained earnings of $146,900, debt service coverage at 2.4, and 6 months of cash expenses held in insured accounts, exactly as his covenant required. By March 2027, the fund accountant reconciled every line. Original Travis-linked deployments and discounted equity had totaled $2,357,000. Required relending by paid-off recipients now added $1,462,000 in zero-interest circulation. Total capital impact reached $3,819,000 without commercial rate interest drag. On-time equivalent repayment stood at 98.1% after approved weather deferrals. Losses to default were still 0. The multiplier effect showed up in acreage and payroll, not just ledgers. Mariah's borrower expanded from leased 80 acres to 140 under a 5-year contract. 1 full-time job added. Owen's borrower cut forage waste enough to avoid a spring operating line for the first time in 5 seasons. Eli and Nora's apprentices split into 2 dairies, that both adopted the reserve first rule. Neil's two borrowers kept fixed costs low enough to withstand a weak milk quarter without requesting payment pause. Rowan's custom clients signed longer service windows because his machine uptime stayed above 96%. Grant hired a third full-time employee and put Dana on payroll formally, with retirement withholding after years of family labor that had gone uncounted. Luis and Elena Mendoza's 60-acre contract reached its 5th annual review in person at Travis's kitchen table. Elena arrived with index soil tests, payment receipts, and grazing maps. Luis unfolded a hand-drawn waterline plan and asked permission to prepay 2 years early if pasture contracts held. Travis studied the numbers, then wrote one adjustment. Prepayment allowed, but only after Elena established a separate repair reserve equal to 8% of annual gross. Elena smiled, not because terms loosened, but because the terms were clear. Their place had added 18 cow-calf pairs, stayed current each quarter, and never opened an operating line. Hank Bolger's final resolution came on a windy April afternoon at a machinery lot outside Marshalltown. He had been retired from full-time sales for nearly 2 years, consulting 3 days a week, and he asked Travis to walk the row with him before a dealer training started. Used tractors were lined in faded green and red, hour meters documented, service records clipped to windshields. No spotlight units up front, no urgency signs. He stopped beside a 2009 utility tractor with 5,400 hours and said, "I almost said something at that 2019 auction. I had a sentence ready. I was going to tell the finance bidders you could not clear the check. Then the bank confirmed it, and I understood I had mistaken appearance for liquidity for 20 years. Travis checked the rear tire tread, then the hydraulic couplers. "You changed." "I had to." He tapped a clipboard. "We now run downside cash scenarios before quote sheets. If a plan fails a bad price year, we do not push it." He had his own arithmetic. Under the old model, his region averaged 11.2% contract fallout in correction years and expensive repossession cycles that damaged customers and dealers alike. Under the revised used first model with stress testing, fallout dropped below 4.9%, service retention increased, and repeat business improved because farms survived. He did not become sentimental about it. He became precise. At the training, he stood in front of 22 younger reps and used 2 anonymized case files. One was his 2011 package style. High fixed payments, thin downside room, polished assumptions. The other was repair first, principal first, reserve first. He asked the room which customer would still be buying parts in 10 years. Nobody answered quickly. Then he pointed to the second sheet and said, "Sell survivability." That was as close as he came to apology. It was enough. The roll call by Harvest 2028 read like a county ledger finally balanced by discipline. Martin Hale remained at the bank and had formalized forced sale risk as required language in dairy underwriting. Neil Porter managed rotation blocks on Jennings Acres, remained current on all obligations, and had no variable rate exposure left. Beth Kalinsky directed calf health training for the fund and certified 4 instructors, each required to teach documentation before treatment protocol. Mariah Sutter operated debt-free except for a short seasonal input float she cleared each fall by contract. Owen Pike kept his reserve target and financed 1 additional beginner after his first borrower graduated. Eli and Nora Vance maintained 0 operating debt and expanded labor, not leverage. Rowan Dyer continued custom forage and compliance mentoring. Dana and Cole Reamer worked inside Grant's dairy without signing personal guarantees, the specific burden that had once broken them. Grant remained current, profitable, and conservative on expansion timing. Luis and Elena Mendoza stayed current every quarter, improved forage carrying capacity, and passed their conservation inspection without correction items. And Travis stayed in the same rhythm. She was 71 by then, slower on icy mornings, still first in the parlor on most days, still using the 1999 Ford for feed store runs, odometer above 372,000. The 1978 grinder remained in service after a second bearing rebuild and one motor rewind. The metal drawer folder Martin once brought had been archived in labeled binders by year, with principal postings cross-checked and signed. The coffee can receipt habit. Nail showed that winter became a fund requirement for first-year borrowers, then evolved into digital scans backed by paper originals at Beth's insistence. The old grain bin ledger in Glenn's pencil had been preserved in a clear sleeve, scanned twice, and stored in a fire-rated cabinet at the fund office. The scanned copy stayed in every training packet. The weather-damaged, glossy proposal Hank left on the hood years earlier remained exactly what the record said it was. Declined financing exhibit, discarded after documentation, no further action. One strange detail people had whispered about in 2011 never did pay off. The two Tama County brothers who had watched Travis at the rail and traded looks never spoke to her about that day, never asked questions, never offered explanation. They kept farming, paid their own notes, and by 2028, both had shifted to used equipment in shorter terms. Sometimes silence is all the resolution a county gets. On a clear evening in October 2028, after second cutting was wrapped and calves were bedded, Travis sat at the same kitchen table where she once mapped an 18-month liquidation clock. Beth was across from her, reviewing apprentice logs. Martin had dropped off annual confirmation packets. Neil had left seed invoices sorted by field. The house was quiet except for the wall clock and the low hum of the refrigerator that had outlived 2 administrations and 1 compressor swap. Travis signed the fund authorization for another cycle of zero-interest notes, capped by repairability and reserve rules, then set her pen down. Wealth had never looked different on her. It looked different on everybody around her. Fewer forced sales, more current notes, more families choosing timing instead of accepting it. The same patched gate latch held, the same truck cooled in the yard. Under the light above the office door, a fresh contract waited for the next beginner. Plain language, no decoration, one rule that had outlasted every trend in the county. Stay current, stay modest, and when your note is gone, finance one more without charging interest.